I knew the moment I saw Brenda Carmichael's white SUV pull into my driveway that my peaceful Friday afternoon was about to turn into a nightmare. She didn't knock on my front door like a normal person. Instead, she marched around to my backyard where I was grilling burgers, clutching a stack of papers like they were the 10 Commandments themselves. "Samuel Jennings, we need to talk about your flagrant violation of HOA regulations," she announced, her voice sharp enough to cut through the sizzle of beef on hot metal. I turned down the grill and wiped my hands on my apron, already feeling my blood pressure rising. Brenda was the newly elected president of the Meadowbrook Heights Homeowners Association here in Boulder, Colorado, and in the 3 months since she'd taken office, she'd made it her personal mission to harass every single resident about something. Last week, it was the Hendersons and their mailbox being 2 inches too tall. The week before that, she'd fined the Rodriguezes because their hedge was supposedly blocking the sidewalk by a 1/4 inch. "What violation would that be, Brenda?" I asked, keeping my voice level. She thrust the papers at me. "These utility easements running through your property. They're unsightly and in violation of Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the HOA bylaws regarding visual obstruction and property maintenance." I looked at the papers. They were copies of the easement documents for my property, which she must have pulled from county records. The easements in question were the power line corridors that ran along the back edge of my 5-acre lot. I'd purchased this property specifically because it was one of the larger parcels in the neighborhood. And yes, it came with utility easements, but those easements were legally established decades before the HOA even existed. Brenda, those easements are legally recorded. They were here long before this neighborhood was even developed. I can't just make them disappear. "I'm not asking you to make them disappear," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "I'm demanding that you improve their appearance. Those utility poles are an eyesore. You need to have them buried underground or relocated off the property entirely. You have 30 days to comply, or you'll face fines of $500 per day." I actually laughed. I couldn't help it. "You want me to relocate power lines? Do you have any idea what you're asking?" "I know exactly what I'm asking. This is a premium neighborhood, Samuel. Property values matter. Your negligence is affecting everyone's investment." "My negligence?" I set down my spatula. "Brenda, I don't own those power lines. They belong to Boulder Electric Cooperative. I can't just tell them to move their infrastructure. Then you'll need to negotiate with them. That's not my problem. The HOA has spoken and you will comply." She turned on her heel and started to walk away. "Brenda, wait," I called after her. She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Have you actually read those easement documents?" "I've read enough to know they're your responsibility." "No, I don't think you have. Because if you had, you'd know something very interesting about those particular power lines." She turned fully back toward me, her eyes narrowing. "And what would that be?" I smiled, but I wasn't feeling friendly. "Those easements. They're not just standard utility easements. They're private easements. I own the lines themselves, not just the land they cross. Boulder Electric leases access from me to service the neighborhood, including your house." The color drained from her face slightly, but she recovered quickly. "That's ridiculous. Power companies own the power lines." "Usually, yes, but this property has a unique history. When this land was originally developed, back in the 1970s, my grandfather was one of the primary investors. He owned this entire area before it was subdivided. When Boulder Electric wanted to run power out here, he agreed, but only if he maintained ownership of the actual infrastructure on his retained property. He leased them the right to use and maintain the lines, but ownership stayed with him. When he passed, it came to me along with this property. I don't believe you. You're welcome to check with the county recorder's office, or better yet, call Boulder Electric. They can confirm it. Every month they pay me a lease fee for those easements. Brenda's jaw clenched. Even if that's true, which I doubt, it doesn't change the HOA's position. Those lines are unsightly and must be addressed. Let me make sure I understand you correctly, I said slowly. You're demanding that I relocate or bury power lines that I own, which currently provide electricity to every house in this neighborhood, including yours. The HOA has the authority to enforce aesthetic standards. Not on privately owned utility infrastructure, you don't, and especially not when that infrastructure predates the HOA by about 40 years. We'll see about that. You'll be hearing from our attorney. She spun around and stalked back toward her vehicle. I watched her leave, then pulled out my phone and made a call to my own attorney, Marcus Patterson. Marcus and I had gone to college together at the University of Colorado, and he'd been handling my property matters for years. He knew all about the unique situation with my utility easements. "Marcus, it's Sam. I've got an HOA problem. Don't you always?" he replied with a chuckle. "What's Brenda done now? She's demanding I relocate or bury the power lines on my property. Says they're an eyesore." There was a pause. "The lines you own, the very same." "Oh, this is going to be fun. What did you tell her?" "That I own them, that they predate the HOA, and that she should probably back off. She didn't take it well." "I'll send her a letter first thing Monday morning. In the meantime, don't do anything. Let her make the next move." "That's what I figured. Thanks, Marcus." I hung up and tried to get back to my burgers, but they were already burnt. The afternoon was ruined. I scraped them off the grill and went inside, my appetite gone. The following Monday morning, I was up early working in my home office. I ran a consulting business for renewable energy projects, which meant most of my work could be done remotely. I was on a video call with a client in California when I saw Brenda's SUV pull up again, this time accompanied by 2 other vehicles. Great. I wrapped up the call and headed outside. Brenda had brought reinforcements, 2 other HOA board members, Patricia Whitmore and Gregory Nash. Patricia was a retired school teacher who seemed to agree with everything Brenda said, while Gregory was a middle-aged accountant who always looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. "Samuel, we need to discuss your non-compliance," Brenda started immediately. "Brenda, it's been 3 days. Your initial letter gave me 30 days. That was before I consulted with our attorney. He's informed me that we have grounds to pursue immediate injunctive relief due to the severity of the violation." I crossed my arms. "Your attorney told you that you can get an injunction against privately owned utility infrastructure. I'd love to know who this attorney is, because they're giving you terrible advice." Gregory cleared his throat. "Sam, look, nobody wants this to become a big legal battle. Can't we work something out? Maybe you could plant some trees to screen the poles." "I'm not opposed to that, Gregory. I'd be happy to do some landscaping. What I'm opposed to is Brenda's demand that I relocate or bury the lines entirely. That's not reasonable or legal." "Everything we do is legal," Brenda snapped, "and I'm prepared to prove it. This afternoon, the HOA board will be voting to impose immediate fines for your violation. We'll also be filing a lawsuit to force compliance." "You're going to sue me to make me relocate power lines that serve your own house?" I asked incredulously. "If that's what it takes to maintain neighborhood standards, yes." Patricia nodded enthusiastically. "Property values are paramount." Gregory looked uncomfortable but said nothing. "Fine," I said. "Do what you feel you need to do, but I'm warning you, Brenda, you're making a serious mistake. The only mistake being made here is yours. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I've successfully sued 3 different contractors, 2 former employers, and an entire school board. I don't lose. There's a first time for everything, I replied quietly. They left, and I immediately called Marcus again. They're really going through with it? He asked after I filled him in. Apparently. Brenda's on a warpath. Okay, here's what's going to happen. They'll file their lawsuit probably within the next week. We'll respond with a motion to dismiss based on lack of jurisdiction and the fact that your easements are protected. We'll also file a counterclaim for harassment and abusive process. But Sam, I want to give you a heads up about something. What's that? If this gets ugly, and it sounds like it will, you have some leverage that Brenda doesn't know about. What kind of leverage? Your lease agreement with Boulder Electric. You're not required to maintain those lines in perpetuity. You have the right to terminate the lease with 12 months' notice, as long as you provide alternative routing or service arrangements. I was silent for a moment, processing that. Marcus, if I terminated that lease, the neighborhood would lose power. Not necessarily. Boulder Electric would have to find another route, or they'd have to negotiate with you for a new agreement. But yes, it would create significant complications. I'm not going to do that. These people are my neighbors. I'm not going to leave them without electricity just because Brenda's being unreasonable. I'm not suggesting you actually do it. I'm saying you have leverage if you need it. Sometimes just knowing you have that option is enough to bring reasonable people to the table. Brenda's not reasonable people. No, but the rest of the HOA board might be. And the other residents definitely will be if they find out what she's risking. We talked for a few more minutes about strategy, and then I got back to work. I tried to focus on my projects, but my mind kept wandering back to the situation with the HOA. I'd lived in Meadowbrook Heights for 8 years, and until Brenda took over, it had been a pleasant place to live. The previous HOA president, Tom Hendricks, had been practical and reasonable. He'd understood that the point of an HOA was to maintain property values and common areas, not to micromanage every aspect of residents' lives. But Tom had moved to Arizona last year, and in the resulting election, Brenda had run unopposed. She'd immediately started implementing new rules and regulations, raising fees, and generally making everyone miserable. I'd heard through the neighborhood grapevine that several families were considering moving because of her. That evening, my neighbor Dave Fulton stopped by. Dave lived on the adjacent property and was one of my good friends in the neighborhood. He was a contractor who'd built his own house, and we often shared beers and talked about property maintenance and local politics. "Hey Sam, heard you're having trouble with Brenda," he said as I handed him a bottle of beer. "News travels fast. She came by my place today too. Said I need to repaint my fence because the color doesn't match the approved palette. Sam, my fence is the same color it's been for 6 years. It was approved by the HOA when I built it. That's insane. That's Brenda. Look, I've been talking to some of the other neighbors. A lot of people are fed up. We're thinking about organizing a recall election. You can do that, according to the HOA bylaws, yeah. We need signatures from 30% of the homeowners to trigger a recall vote, and then a majority to remove her. I don't think that'll be hard to get." "Count me in," I said immediately. "What do you need?" "Just your signature for now. I'm going to start circulating a petition this week." "But Sam, I heard about the thing with your power lines. Is it true you actually own them?" "It's true. My grandfather negotiated the deal back in the 70s. Dave whistled. "That's quite a setup. How much does Boulder Electric pay you?" "About $1,800 a month. It's not a fortune, but it's nice passive income." "And Brenda wants you to give that up. She wants me to bury the lines or relocate them. She doesn't seem to understand that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly over $1 million, and that I have no legal obligation to do it." What happens if she pushes this? I hesitated, then told him what Marcus had explained about my ability to terminate the lease. Dave's eyes went wide. You could cut power to the whole neighborhood. Technically, yes, but I wouldn't do that. It's not fair to everyone else. But Brenda doesn't know that, does she? I don't know what Brenda knows or doesn't know at this point. She seems to think she can bully me into compliance. Dave was quiet for a moment, then said, "Sam, I know you don't want to hurt innocent people, but maybe Brenda needs to understand what she's risking. If she knew you had that option, she might back off, or she might double down. You know how she is." True. But at least the other board members would know. Patricia just does whatever Brenda says, but Gregory's reasonable, and there are 5 board positions total. If Gregory and the other 2 members understood the stakes, they might vote to drop this whole thing. The other 2 members, Jennifer Martinez and Tom Bergman, they're both pretty quiet, usually just go along with whatever, but they're not unreasonable like Brenda. I thought about it. Let me talk to Marcus first. I don't want to make any threats I'm not prepared to follow through on. Fair enough. But think about it. Sometimes the best way to deal with a bully is to show them you can hit back harder. After Dave left, I sat on my back porch and looked out at the power lines in question. They weren't beautiful, but they weren't hideous either. Just standard utility poles marching across the back of my property, carrying electricity to about 60 homes in the neighborhood. My grandfather had been a smart businessman. He'd seen an opportunity to retain control of valuable infrastructure while still allowing development, and he'd taken it. I'd never expected to actually need that control for anything. The lease agreement with Boulder Electric was straightforward. They maintained the lines, they paid me monthly, and everyone was happy. Now Brenda was threatening to turn the whole thing into a legal nightmare. The next morning, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney, a man named Richard Cunningham. The letter was full of legal jargon, but the gist was clear. I was in violation of HOA covenants. I needed to remedy the situation immediately, and if I didn't, they would seek injunctive relief and daily fines. I scanned the letter and emailed it to Marcus. He called me within an hour. "This is even worse than I thought." "How so?" "Cunningham's a real piece of work. I've dealt with him before. He's the kind of attorney who throws everything at the wall to see what sticks. He doesn't care if he has a good case or not. He just tries to bury the opposition in paperwork and legal fees until they give up." "So what do?" We respond forcefully. "I'm going to draft a reply that makes it crystal clear you own this infrastructure, that it predates the HOA, and that they have no jurisdiction. I'm also going to include a copy of your deed, the original easement agreements, and your lease with Boulder Electric. If they want to push this, they're going to have to do it knowing they'll lose and knowing they'll be on the hook for your legal fees when they do. You think that'll stop them?" "Honestly, probably not. From what you've told me about Brenda, she sounds like the type who has to learn the hard way, but it might give the other board members pause, and it'll create a strong record for when we countersue." "We're really going to countersue if they file against you?" "Absolutely. Abuse of process, harassment, maybe even intentional infliction of emotional distress depending on how far they take this. Sam, they're threatening you with fines of $500 per day. That's $15,000 a month. Over 30 days, that's your entire annual lease payment from Boulder Electric. They're essentially trying to force you to give up a valuable property right through economic coercion. Put that way, it sounded even worse. Okay, do what you need to do." Over the next week, things escalated quickly. Marcus sent his response letter to Cunningham. The HOA board held a meeting and voted to impose the fines, starting immediately. According to Gregory, who'd called me afterward, the vote was 3-2 with Brenda, Patricia, and Jennifer voting yes, and Gregory and Tom voting no. "I'm sorry, Sam," Gregory had said. "I tried to explain to them what you'd told us about owning the lines, but Brenda insisted her attorney said we have the right to enforce aesthetic standards regardless of ownership. Her attorney is wrong. I think so too, but I'm just one vote. Look, Tom and I are going to keep fighting this from the inside, but you should know that Brenda's planning to file the lawsuit this week. I appreciate you trying, Gregory. The lawsuit came on Friday. I was served with papers at my front door by a process server who looked apologetic about the whole thing. The complaint was 37 pages, long and full of allegations about how my negligent maintenance and refusal to comply with reasonable regulations was damaging property values and creating a nuisance. Marcus filed our response the following Wednesday. It was shorter than their complaint, only 15 pages, but it was devastating. He included all the documentation showing my ownership of the infrastructure, the lease agreement, and expert opinions from 2 different real estate attorneys, confirming that the HOA had no jurisdiction over privately owned utility infrastructure. Then he added the kicker: a counterclaim for $150,000 in damages for abuse of process, harassment, and attorney's fees. Brenda did not take it well. She showed up at my house the day after we filed the counterclaim, angrier than I'd ever seen her. "How dare you countersue the HOA?" she screamed from my driveway. I'd seen her coming and had stayed inside, watching through the window. "This is a frivolous lawsuit designed to intimidate us." I opened my front door but didn't step outside. "Brenda, you sued me first. Over something I have every legal right to maintain. My counterclaim is a response to your abuse of the legal system. You're going to lose, and when you do, I'm going to make sure you pay every penny of our legal fees." Actually, Colorado law provides that in HOA disputes, if the HOA is found to have acted unreasonably, they have to pay the homeowner's fees. You might want to discuss that with your attorney. Richard says we have an excellent case. Then I guess we'll let the court decide. But Brenda, I want you to understand something. I've tried to be reasonable. I've tried to explain the situation. You're the one who's pushed this into litigation, and I'm not going to back down. We'll see about that. She stormed back to her car. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling exhausted. This was exactly what I'd wanted to avoid. I didn't want to be at war with my HOA. I just wanted to live in peace and maintain my property rights. The next few weeks were a blur of legal motions and discovery requests. Cunningham demanded copies of every document related to my property, my finances, and my agreement with Boulder Electric. Marcus responded by demanding copies of all HOA meeting minutes, financial records, and communications between board members regarding my property. What we found in those communications was enlightening and disturbing. There were emails between Brenda and Patricia discussing how they needed to make an example of me to show other homeowners that the board meant business. There were text messages where Brenda referred to me as that arrogant man who thinks he can do whatever he wants. Most damningly, there was an email where Brenda told Cunningham to find any way possible to force compliance, regardless of the legal merits. Marcus immediately filed a motion to include these communications as evidence of bad faith. He also sent copies to Gregory and Tom, suggesting they share them with the other homeowners. That's when things really started to shift. Dave's petition for a recall election had been circulating, and within 2 weeks, he'd gathered signatures from over 50% of the homeowners. The recall election was scheduled for 6 weeks out. But more importantly, homeowners were starting to ask questions about how much the lawsuit was costing. The HOA's annual budget was about $200,000, funded by dues of $300 per month from each of the 60 homes. Most of that money went to maintaining common areas, the neighborhood pool and clubhouse, and basic administrative costs. Legal fees weren't normally a significant expense. But Cunningham was billing at $400 per hour, and with all the motions and discovery, the fees were adding up fast. By the time we were a month into litigation, the HOA had already spent nearly $30,000. At the next board meeting, which I attended along with about 40 other homeowners, Jennifer Martinez raised the issue. "Brenda, I'm looking at our legal bills and I'm concerned. We've spent $30,000 in 1 month. At this rate, we're going to deplete our reserves completely." "The cost is necessary to enforce our standards," Brenda replied stiffly. "But what if we lose?" Tom Bergman asked. "If the court finds we were in the wrong, we could be liable for Sam's legal fees too. That could be another $100,000 or more. We're not going to lose." "Have you actually read the documents Sam's attorney filed?" Gregory interjected. "He clearly owns that infrastructure. Our own attorney admitted in his last memo that it's going to be difficult to establish jurisdiction." Brenda glared at him. "Richard is being overly cautious. He said we still have viable claims." "Viable isn't the same as strong," Gregory shot back. "And it's not your money on the line, it's all of ours." A woman in the back stood up. I recognized her as Linda Chen, who lived on Maple Street. "I want to know why we're even fighting this." "Sam's power lines aren't bothering anyone. They've been there for decades. This seems personal, Brenda." "It's not personal. It's about maintaining standards." "It seems pretty personal," another homeowner called out. "Especially after those emails came out." The meeting devolved into chaos, with multiple people shouting questions and complaints at Brenda. She tried to maintain control, but it was clear she'd lost the room. The meeting ended early with nothing resolved. 2 days later, I got a call from Jennifer Martinez. "Sam, this is Jennifer. We've never really talked, but I'm on the HOA board." "I know who you are, Jennifer. What can I do for you?" "I want to apologize. I voted to impose those fines, and I voted to approve the lawsuit. I didn't really understand the situation." Brenda presented it like you were just being difficult about a simple maintenance issue. "And now I've read the actual documents and I've talked to my own attorney. Sam, we don't have a case. Brenda knew we didn't have a case and she pushed it through anyway. So what happens now?" "Tom, Gregory, and I are going to vote to drop the lawsuit at the next board meeting. Patricia will probably vote with Brenda, but it'll be 3-2. We're also going to vote to censure Brenda for exceeding her authority." "I appreciate that, Jennifer. Really. It's the least we can do." "But Sam, I have to warn you. Brenda's not going to take this well. She's already talking about how you've turned the board against her and poisoned the neighborhood. I think she might do something drastic." "Like what?" "I don't know, but be careful." I thanked her and hung up, then immediately called Marcus to update him. "That's good news," he said. "If the HOA drops the suit, we can dismiss our counterclaim too, and this whole thing can be over." "You think Brenda will let it be over?" "Legally, she won't have a choice. The board controls the HOA's actions, not the president alone." The board meeting where they voted to drop the lawsuit was scheduled for a Thursday evening. I decided to attend, along with Dave and about 30 other homeowners who wanted to see what would happen. Brenda called the meeting to order with visible tension in her jaw. "First item of business is the ongoing litigation with Samuel Jennings." "I'd like to make a motion," Gregory said immediately. "I move that the HOA board vote to dismiss our lawsuit against Sam Jennings and to formally rescind the fines imposed on his property." "I second," Jennifer said. "Discussion." Brenda's voice was icy. "I think the discussion is pretty straightforward," Tom said. We've spent $35,000 on a lawsuit we're going to lose. Our own attorney has admitted that Sam has a strong legal position. Continuing this is fiscally irresponsible and potentially exposes the HOA to significant liability for Sam's legal fees. Richard has assured me we can still prevail, Brenda insisted. No, he hasn't. Gregory pulled out a piece of paper. I specifically asked Richard for a memo on the strength of our case. He gave us a 30% chance of success. 30%, Brenda. That's not good odds, especially when we're gambling with community funds. Where did you get that memo? Brenda demanded. Richard sent it to all board members. You should have it too. Brenda's face flushed. That memo was confidential. It was sent to the board. Board communications aren't confidential from board members. And now that we're discussing it in open session, it's part of the public record. Several homeowners in the audience started talking among themselves. Brenda looked like she wanted to explode. Fine. Let's vote. All in favor of dismissing the lawsuit. Gregory, Jennifer, and Tom raised their hands. Opposed, Brenda and Patricia raised theirs. Motion carries 3-2. Brenda practically spat the words. Is there any other business? Yes, Jennifer said. I'd like to make a motion to formally censure President Carmichael for exceeding her authority in initiating litigation without proper board review, and for making statements to our attorney that contradicted board direction. I second, Tom said immediately. That's outrageous, Brenda shouted. I've done nothing wrong. You told Richard to find any way to force Sam's compliance regardless of legal merits, Gregory said. That's not how we operate. We're supposed to follow the law, not look for ways around it. The vote on the censure was the same, 3-2. Brenda was officially censured. She stood up abruptly, knocking her chair backward. I resign. Effective immediately. You people don't deserve the work I've put into this community. You're all willing to let property values decline just because you're afraid of one man. Brenda, nobody's afraid of Sam, Jennifer said quietly. We just recognize that he's right and we're wrong. You'll regret this, all of you. Brenda grabbed her papers and stormed out of the clubhouse. Patricia hesitated, then followed her. The remaining board members and homeowners sat in stunned silence for a moment. Finally, Dave stood up. Well, that was dramatic. What happens now? Gregory cleared his throat. According to our bylaws, if the president resigns, the vice president takes over. That's me. We'll need to hold a special election to fill the vacant positions. But in the meantime, Tom, Jennifer, and I can handle board business. What about the recall election? Someone asked. I guess that's moot now, Gregory said with a small smile. The meeting wrapped up shortly after. Several neighbors came up to shake my hand and apologize for what I'd been through. Dave clapped me on the shoulder. That went better than I expected. It's not over yet, I said. Brenda said we'd regret this. I don't think she's done. I was right to be worried. 3 days later, I woke up to find that someone had spray-painted "Lawsuit Bully" across my garage door in bright red paint. I immediately called the police and filed a report. The officer who responded took photos and statements, but there were no security cameras that had captured the act and no witnesses. You have any idea who might have done this? Officer Martinez asked. I have a suspicion, but no proof. I told him about the HOA situation and Brenda's resignation. He made notes, but said there wasn't much they could do without evidence. The next morning, I woke up to find my mailbox knocked over. The morning after that, someone had thrown eggs at my front windows. I called the police each time and filed reports. On the third incident, Officer Martinez suggested I install security cameras, which I did immediately. I had a system up and running within 48 hours, covering all sides of my property. The vandalism stopped after that, but I started noticing Brenda's SUV driving slowly past my house several times a day. It was unsettling, but not technically illegal. Then things took a darker turn. I received a call from Marcus on a Monday morning. "Sam, we have a problem. Cunningham just filed a motion claiming that you've threatened to cut off power to the neighborhood unless the lawsuit is dropped." "What? That's completely false. I never said anything like that." "I know. But apparently Brenda gave Cunningham an affidavit claiming you told her you'd terminate your lease with Boulder Electric if the HOA didn't back off." I thought back through all my conversations with Brenda. I'd never said anything of the sort. "Marcus, I never threatened that. Not to her, not to anyone." "What about your conversation with Dave? When you explained you had the right to terminate the lease," my stomach dropped. "That was a private conversation in my backyard. How would she know about that?" "I don't know, but if she overheard somehow, or if someone told her, she's twisting it into a threat." "Can she do that?" "She can file an affidavit. Whether the court believes it is another matter. The problem is, the judge granted a temporary restraining order preventing you from taking any action related to the power lines pending a hearing." "When's the hearing?" "Friday. 4 days from now." I spent the next 4 days preparing with Marcus. We pulled phone records showing I'd never called Brenda. We prepared my testimony about the actual conversation with Dave, which was completely different from what Brenda was claiming. We even had Dave prepared to testify if needed. The hearing was held in Boulder County District Court before Judge Rebecca Thornton. Cunningham argued that I'd threatened essential services to the neighborhood unless the HOA capitulated, and that the court needed to intervene to protect the residents. Marcus countered by pointing out that the HOA had already voted to dismiss the lawsuit, so the entire issue was moot. He also noted that I'd never actually threatened anything, and that Brenda's affidavit was uncorroborated and contradicted by my documented history of maintaining the power lines without incident for 8 years. Judge Thornton listened to both sides, then asked Brenda to take the stand. "Miss Carmichael, you claim that Mr. Jennings threatened to cut power to the neighborhood. When exactly did this threat occur?" "It was about 2 months ago when I first approached him about the easement issue," Brenda said. "And what exactly did he say?" "He said that if the HOA didn't back off, he'd terminate his lease with Boulder Electric and leave us all without power." "Were there any witnesses to this conversation?" "No, it was just the 2 of us." Marcus stood up. "Your Honor, may I?" Judge Thornton nodded. "Miss Carmichael, you testified the conversation happened 2 months ago, correct?" "Yes." "But the HOA didn't file its lawsuit until 6 weeks ago, and according to the board meeting minutes, you didn't even mention any threat from Mr. Jennings when you were advocating for the lawsuit. Don't you think that's something you would have brought up if it had actually happened?" Brenda hesitated. "I thought it was understood." "You thought it was understood, but you didn't actually tell the board that Mr. Jennings had threatened to cut off power." "I mentioned he was being difficult about the easements." "That's not the same as threatening essential services. In fact, Miss Carmichael, isn't it true that you only came up with this claim after the board voted to dismiss the lawsuit, after you resigned in anger?" "That's not true." Marcus pulled out a document. "Your Honor, this is a copy of Mr. Cunningham's motion including Miss Carmichael's affidavit. It was filed 3 days after Miss Carmichael resigned from the HOA board. The timing is rather convenient." Judge Thornton looked at the document, then at Brenda. "Miss Carmichael, I'm inclined to agree with Mr. Patterson. If Mr. Jennings had actually threatened to cut off power to 60 homes, that would be a serious matter that I would expect you to have raised immediately, not weeks later after you'd lost your position. But he did threaten it. Do you have any evidence beyond your own statement?" Any recordings, witnesses, text messages, emails? No. But then I'm not inclined to believe this threat exists. The restraining order is dissolved. Mr. Patterson, does your client wish to proceed with his counterclaim? Marcus looked at me. We discussed this. The HOA had dropped their lawsuit, and I didn't really want to bankrupt the community by pursuing damages. But Brenda was a different story. Your Honor, we'd like to amend our counterclaim. We'll dismiss the claims against the HOA, but we'd like to proceed personally against Miss Carmichael for defamation and abuse of process. Judge Thornton raised an eyebrow. Mr. Patterson, Miss Carmichael was acting in her capacity as HOA president. She was, Your Honor, but she's no longer in that position, and her recent actions, including this false affidavit, have been taken in her personal capacity. She's engaging in a campaign of harassment against my client. I pulled out a folder containing the police reports about the vandalism, the photos of Brenda's car repeatedly driving past my house, and a log I'd been keeping of her actions. Your Honor, since resigning from the HOA board, Miss Carmichael has engaged in what we believe is a systematic effort to harass Mr. Jennings. We have police reports documenting vandalism, surveillance evidence of her repeatedly driving past his home, and now this false affidavit. We believe she's acting out of personal animus. Judge Thornton reviewed the documents. Her expression grew increasingly stern. Miss Carmichael, did you spray paint Mr. Jennings' garage? No. I would never have you been repeatedly driving past his home. I live in the same neighborhood. I have a right to use the streets. Multiple times per day. Taking the same route that goes past his house when there are other routes available. Brenda didn't answer. Miss Carmichael, I'm going to strongly suggest you cease all contact with Mr. Jennings. Don't drive past his house. Don't approach him. Don't communicate with him in any way. If I see you back in this courtroom on related matters, I will not be pleased. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Brenda said stiffly. As for the counterclaim, Mr. Patterson, you're free to proceed if you wish, but I'd encourage both parties to consider whether continued litigation serves anyone's interests. Marcus and I stepped outside the courthouse to discuss. What do you want to do? He asked. I thought about it. I was tired. Tired of the drama, tired of the legal fights, tired of looking over my shoulder wondering what Brenda might do next. I want it to be over. If she leaves me alone, I'll drop the counterclaim. And if she doesn't, then we bury her. Marcus nodded. I'll send a letter to her attorney. One last chance. We never got a response from Brenda or Cunningham, but the harassment stopped. Over the next few weeks, things gradually returned to normal. The HOA held a special election, and 2 new board members were elected to replace Brenda and Patricia, who'd also resigned. Gregory continued as president, and under his leadership, the board took a much more reasonable approach to enforcement. About a month after the hearing, Gregory stopped by my house with a proposal. Sam, the board has been talking, and we'd like to officially apologize for everything that happened. We'd also like to work with you on some landscaping around those utility easements. Not because you have to, but because we think it might be a nice improvement for everyone. What did you have in mind? We found a landscaping company that would plant a row of evergreen trees along the easement line. They'd provide some screening of the poles without interfering with the power lines themselves. The HOA would cover the cost, and you'd maintain them just like the rest of your property. I considered it. The trees would actually be nice, and it would improve the view from my back porch. That seems reasonable. Let's do it. The trees were planted 2 weeks later. They looked good, and several neighbors commented positively about the improvement. It felt like a fresh start. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 3 months after the hearing, I got a call from Officer Martinez. "Mr. Jennings, this is Officer Martinez with Boulder PD. Do you have a few minutes to talk?" "Of course." "What's this about?" "We've been investigating the vandalism incidents at your property from earlier this year. We've developed some evidence, and I wanted to update you." "You found who did it?" "We believe so." A neighbor came forward with doorbell camera footage that captured a vehicle matching Brenda Carmichael's SUV in your area during the time frame of the spray paint incident. We pulled traffic camera data and confirmed her vehicle was in the neighborhood at the relevant times for all 3 incidents. "That's great, but is it enough to press charges?" "That's why I'm calling. We'd like to bring her in for questioning. With your permission, we'd also like to request that the DA consider charges for vandalism and harassment." I thought about everything Brenda had put me through. The stress, the legal fees, the constant worry, but I also thought about what pressing criminal charges would mean. More court appearances, more drama, more time consumed by this nightmare. "Officer, what would happen if charges were filed? Given the value of the damage and the pattern of behavior, we're looking at misdemeanor vandalism charges for each incident, plus potentially a harassment charge. If convicted, she'd likely face fines and probation, possibly some community service. Would she have a criminal record?" "Yes, though misdemeanors are less serious than felonies." I was quiet for a moment. Martinez continued, "Mr. Jennings, I want to be clear. This isn't just about your property. Miss Carmichael engaged in a pattern of criminal behavior in an attempt to intimidate you. That's serious. If we don't pursue this, what's to stop her from doing the same thing to someone else?" He had a point. Brenda had shown herself willing to break the law when she didn't get her way. If she faced no consequences, she might target someone else down the line. "Okay, file the charges." "Thank you. We'll be in touch." 2 weeks later, Brenda was arrested and charged with 3 counts of misdemeanor vandalism and 1 count of misdemeanor harassment. According to Dave, who heard it through the neighborhood grapevine, she was released on her own recognizance and was furious, claiming she was being persecuted. The case went to trial 4 months later. I had to testify about the incidents and the overall pattern of Brenda's behavior. The prosecution presented the doorbell camera footage, traffic camera data, and testimony from multiple neighbors about Brenda's angry statements regarding me. Brenda's attorney tried to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that someone else could have committed the vandalism, but it wasn't convincing. The traffic camera data showed her vehicle passing my house within minutes of the incidents, and there was no legitimate reason for her to be in my specific area at those times given her own home was in a different section of the neighborhood. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. At sentencing, the judge gave Brenda a stern lecture about respecting others' property and using appropriate legal channels rather than resorting to vandalism. She was sentenced to 1 year of probation, 200 hours of community service, and ordered to pay restitution for the damage to my property, which came to about $3,000, including the cost of repainting my garage and replacing my mailbox. She was also ordered to have no contact with me, which meant she effectively couldn't attend any HOA functions where I might be present. I ran into Patricia in the grocery store a few weeks after the sentencing. She looked embarrassed when she saw me. "Sam, I owe you an apology. I went along with Brenda on everything, and I should have known better." "Water under the bridge, Patricia. How are you doing?" "Better. I've been doing some thinking about why I let Brenda lead me around like that. I think I just liked feeling important, being on the board and enforcing rules. But it wasn't about the community, it was about control. It takes courage to recognize that. I heard about Brenda's sentencing, Part of me feels bad for her, but part of me thinks she brought it on herself. She did, but I hope she learns from it. So do I. Life in Meadowbrook Heights gradually returned to a peaceful normal. Gregory proved to be an excellent HOA president, focusing on genuine community needs rather than petty enforcement. The neighborhood pool was renovated, the common areas were beautifully maintained, and actual problems were addressed promptly and fairly. My power lines continued to supply electricity to the neighborhood without incident. Boulder Electric continued to pay me monthly, and every year I'd get a small escalation payment based on inflation adjustments in the lease. The trees along the easement grew nicely, providing the screening everyone wanted while still allowing clear access for maintenance. About a year after Brenda's sentencing, I heard she'd moved out of the neighborhood. Someone said she'd bought a condo in Denver. I hoped she'd found some peace and learned to let go of her need to control everything around her. As for me, I learned some valuable lessons too. I learned that standing up for your rights isn't always comfortable, but it's necessary. I learned that most people are reasonable when they understand the full situation. And I learned that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to be bullied. I also learned to appreciate the value of what my grandfather had built. He'd created a unique arrangement with those utility easements, maintaining control while still serving the community. He'd built something that provided value to everyone involved. That was worth protecting, not just for the money, but for the principle. Dave and I still get together regularly for beers on my back porch. We often laugh about the whole situation with Brenda, though at the time it wasn't funny at all. You know what the crazy thing is? Dave said one evening as we watched the sun set behind those power lines. Brenda could have just asked nicely. If she'd approached you like a reasonable person and suggested some landscaping improvements, you probably would have agreed. I definitely would have. I'm not unreasonable. But she had to make it a power play. She had to be in control. And in trying to control something she had no right to control, she lost everything. There's probably a lesson in that. Probably several. We clinked our beer bottles together and enjoyed the peaceful evening. The power lines hummed softly in the background, carrying electricity to all the homes around us, just as they'd been doing for decades. They'd outlasted Brenda's reign of terror, and they'd outlast whatever came next. Looking back on everything, I realized that the entire conflict had been unnecessary. If the HOA had simply followed proper procedures, if Brenda had listened to reason, if anyone had taken the time to actually understand the situation before reacting, none of it would have happened. But that's often how these things go. People get invested in being right, in winning, in proving their point, and they lose sight of what actually matters. What mattered was community. Neighbors treating each other with respect. People working together to maintain a pleasant place to live. The HOA was supposed to facilitate that, not undermine it. Under Gregory's leadership, that's exactly what it became. Meetings were productive rather than confrontational. Issues were addressed collaboratively. When problems arose, they were solved through discussion and compromise rather than threats and lawsuits. The neighborhood thrived. Property values did actually increase, not because of strict enforcement of petty rules, but because people genuinely enjoyed living there. Families moved in. Kids played in the streets. The community pool was always full on summer days. It became the kind of place the HOA's original founders had probably envisioned. And my power lines. They just kept doing their job, quietly and efficiently, the way good infrastructure should. They were a reminder that sometimes the best solution is the one that's been working all along. You don't fix what isn't broken, and you don't pick fights you can't win. I never did terminate that lease with Boulder Electric, and I never plan to. It serves everyone well, including me. My grandfather understood that the best business arrangements are the ones where everyone benefits. He was a wise man. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd backed down when Brenda first confronted me. If I'd agreed to try to relocate the lines, or if I'd just paid the fines to avoid conflict. Would she have been satisfied? Or would she have just found something else to target? I suspect the latter. People like Brenda don't stop when you give in. They just escalate. Standing up to her was the right choice, even though it was difficult and expensive and stressful. Because the alternative would have been surrendering my property rights and setting a precedent that the HOA could bully anyone into anything. That wouldn't have been good for me, and it wouldn't have been good for the neighborhood either. Sometimes you have to fight, not because you want to, but because the cost of not fighting is too high. The legal fees ended up costing me about $40,000 total, even though we won and even though the lawsuit was dropped. Marcus did his best to keep costs down, but litigation is expensive. The restitution from Brenda covered the actual property damage, but not the stress and time. Still, it was worth it. My property rights were protected. The HOA learned important lessons about its limitations, and the neighborhood ended up better off with leadership that actually served the community's interests. I framed the final dismissal order from the court and hung it in my home office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. A reminder that you can stand up to bullies and win. A reminder that the law does protect people when they're in the right. And a reminder that sometimes the quiet power of simply being correct is stronger than all the bluster and threats in the world. These days, when I look out at those power lines, I feel grateful. Grateful for my grandfather's foresight. Grateful for good neighbors like Dave and Gregory. Grateful for a legal system that, despite its flaws, ultimately worked the way it should. And grateful for the peace that comes from knowing I stood my ground when it mattered. The whole experience changed my perspective on a lot of things. I'm more engaged in community affairs now, attending HOA meetings regularly and volunteering for committees. I want to help ensure that what happened with Brenda never happens again, that the HOA remains a force for good rather than a vehicle for someone's power trips. I also developed a deeper appreciation for the mundane infrastructure that makes modern life possible. Those power lines, the water pipes underground, the roads and sewers and all the rest of it. We take it for granted until something threatens it. Then we realize how important it is, how much we depend on systems working correctly. My grandfather understood that. He saw the value in controlling essential infrastructure, not to exploit people, but to ensure it was maintained properly and served its purpose. He could have refused to allow the power lines entirely, or he could have sold the easement rights outright. Instead, he created an arrangement that worked for everyone and lasted for generations. That's the kind of legacy I want to leave too. Not conflict and resentment, but solutions that serve the community while protecting individual rights. It's not always easy to find that balance, but it's worth striving for. As I write this, it's been almost 2 years since the whole mess with Brenda started. The trees along the easement are growing beautifully. The neighborhood is peaceful. The HOA is functional and reasonable. My relationship with Boulder Electric remains strong, and they recently approached me about potentially expanding the service to some new development adjacent to our neighborhood, which would mean additional lease payments. Life is good. The power flows, literally and figuratively. And I'm reminded every day that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it costs you time and money and peace of mind, is always worth it in the end. Because the alternative is letting people like Brenda run roughshod over everyone, and that's not a world I want to live in. Sometimes you have to fight. Sometimes you have to risk everything to protect what matters. And sometimes, if you're lucky and you're right, you win. I won. The neighborhood won. And even Brenda, though she'd never admit it, probably learned something from the experience. Maybe she'll think twice before trying to bully someone else. Maybe she'll approach conflicts with more humility and less certainty that she's always right. Or maybe she won't. Either way, it's not my problem anymore. I've moved on. I'm focused on building relationships, maintaining my property, running my business, and being a good neighbor and community member. The power lines hum steadily in the background, a constant reminder of the whole saga. But they're also a reminder that good infrastructure, built on solid legal and financial foundations, endures. It outlasts the conflicts and the personalities and the temporary insanity of people who think they can control what isn't theirs to control. My grandfather knew that. Now I know it too. And I'll pass that knowledge on, along with the property and the easements, to whoever comes after me. It's a legacy worth preserving, not just for the money but for the principle. Property rights matter. The rule of law matters. Standing up to bullies matters. And sometimes, just sometimes, having control of the power lines gives you exactly the leverage you need to protect yourself and your community from those who would abuse their authority. I never used that leverage the way Brenda feared I might. I never threatened to cut anyone's power. But the fact that I could, the fact that I had that ultimate authority over infrastructure they depended on, made people think twice about how far they could push me. That's the real power. Not in using the weapon, but in having it. Not in making threats, but in having the capacity to protect yourself if threats are made against you. It's the power of preparedness, the power of having options, the power of being in a strong legal and financial position. Brenda never understood that. She thought power came from position and authority and the ability to fine and sue people. But real power comes from ownership, from legal rights, from having something valuable that people need and respecting that responsibility. I hope she learned that lesson. I hope whoever takes on an HOA leadership position in the future remembers this story and approaches their role with humility and respect for homeowners' rights. Because at the end of the day, an HOA is supposed to serve the homeowners, not rule over them. It's supposed to maintain common areas and enforce reasonable standards, not engage in personal vendettas and power plays. Under Gregory's leadership, that's exactly what our HOA has become. And I'm proud to be part of this community, proud to contribute to its success, and proud that I stood my ground when it mattered most. The power lines stand as silent witnesses to all of this. They were there before the conflict, they remained steady during it, and they'll be there long after everyone involved is gone. That's the nature of good infrastructure. It endures. And that's the lesson I take from all of this. Build things that endure, stand for principles that matter, and don't let anyone bully you into giving up what's rightfully yours. Do those things and you'll be fine. The electricity flows. The community thrives. And I sleep soundly at night, knowing I did the right thing.